May 5, 1943, somewhere over New Britain Island, at roughly 12,000 feet, an American reconnaissance pilot named Fred Hargesheimer drifted down under his parachute. His plane had been shredded by enemy fire. Below him stretched a dense, unforgiving jungle, full of danger, hostile troops, headhunters, crocodile-infested rivers. Tonight, I want to tell you a story not just about war, but about mercy, reconnection, and the capacity for transformation. It's a story of a Japanese pilot whose choice changed one man's life, and whose humanity echoed across decades. Fred Hargesheimer's fall from the sky began with a moment of violent chaos. On his 49th mission, he piloted a Lockheed F-5, the unarmed reconnaissance version of the P-38 Lightning, tasked with photographing Japanese positions over New Britain. It should have been a routine run, quiet, quick, invisible. Instead, a Japanese Ki-45 Nick fighter rose up from the clouds beneath him, its cannons erupting in flashes of fire. The F-5 shuddered violently as rounds tore through the fuselage. Hargesheimer tried to steady the aircraft, but when he reached for the canopy, it jammed. A second later, the crippled plane split open, and he was sucked into the roaring wind. The cockpit disappeared above him as he tumbled toward the vast green carpet of jungle. In those dizzying seconds, he had no idea whether he would survive the descent or what awaited him below, only that the world he knew had vanished. When he struck the ground, bruised and shaken, the war did not release him. It swallowed him whole. For 31 days, Hargesheimer wandered the dense forests of New Britain, a place so impenetrable that even today large portions remain unexplored. His emergency chocolate ration disappeared in the first few days, leaving him to scrape by on snails, wild greens, and whatever rainwater he could collect. The jungle punished him relentlessly. Leeches clung to his ankles. Fever swept through his body, raising the spectre of malaria. Nights were the worst, filled with the rasping hum of insects and the unsettling sense of unseen eyes just beyond the shadows. And yet, in this hostile wilderness, he clung to something deeper than survival instinct. He recited Psalm 23 again and again. "The Lord is my shepherd," letting the familiar rhythm steady his thoughts when fear threatened to unravel him. It was a lifeline no compass could provide. Then came the moment that must have felt like a hallucination at first, the sound of paddles dipping rhythmically into water. Weak and half delirious, he made his way toward the riverbank, where he saw canoes carrying islanders from the Nakanai people. These were men and women who had learned to live with the dangers of both the jungle and the occupying Japanese forces, and they instantly understood the peril the downed airman faced. They took him in without hesitation, wrapping him in care he could never have expected. Over the following weeks, they hid him from Japanese patrols, soldiers who were often brutal toward anyone suspected of helping Allied forces. Villagers risked punishment, even death, yet they built shelters for him, shared their limited food, and used herbal medicines to ease his fevers. Hargesheimer later said that he had never known such kindness, especially in a place where offering it came at such a steep cost. What the islanders provided was far more than physical safety. They restored his sense of humanity at a time when the war around him existed primarily to destroy it. Their courage and compassion planted in him a lifelong gratitude, one that would one day inspire him to cross an ocean again, this time not as a pilot, but as a friend returning to repay a debt written not in duty, but in grace. After 8 months hidden in the shadows of the New Britain jungle, Hargesheimer's rescue felt almost unreal. The villagers who had sheltered him passed news of the mysterious American airman through quiet channels until it reached the Australian coast. Watchers stationed along the islands. These coast watchers, unsung heroes of the Pacific War, were men who lived behind enemy lines, intercepting Japanese communications and helping downed Allied aviators survive. When they learned of Hargesheimer's whereabouts, they coordinated with the US Navy to extract him. His rescue came not with the roar of an airplane, but with the silent emergence of a submarine gliding toward shore at night. It was a scene worthy of film a week, bearded airmen emerging from the jungle, guided by islanders who had kept him alive, stepping into the hands of sailors who had risked their own lives to retrieve him. In that moment, the war seemed briefly suspended, replaced by a chain of human compassion stretching across cultures and continents. Returning to America after such an ordeal, Hargesheimer found that something inside him had shifted. He had been spared death 3 times. First by the Japanese pilot who didn't fire again, then by the islanders who risked punishment to shelter him, and finally by the brave coast watchers and submarine crew who delivered him home. That kind of grace does not leave a person unchanged. He realized he carried a profound debt, not in the financial sense, but in a moral one. His survival had been purchased by extraordinary kindness, and he felt called, deeply urgently, to give something back. For years he spoke of how the people of New Britain had shown him a form of humanity that transcended the brutality of war. They had sheltered him like a brother, and he vowed that one day he would return, not as the frightened young pilot they had rescued, but as a man ready to repay their courage with his own acts of service. In the early 1960s, that promise led him across the ocean once more. Many veterans never wished to revisit the places of their trauma, but Hargesheimer stepped ashore on New Britain with a heart full of gratitude. The villagers recognized him instantly. They had not forgotten the man who had once walked among them, weakened and frightened, nor the bond forged in those dangerous months. Instead of suspicion or distance, he was met with embraces, laughter, and the unmistakable warmth of old friends reunited. That homecoming alone would have been powerful enough, but for Hargesheimer, it was only the beginning. Back in the United States, he began raising money not through grand campaigns or corporate sponsorships, but through small, humble donations. Friends, neighbors, former colleagues, many gave only $5 or $10 at a time. Yet little by little, those modest gifts accumulated. Over 3 years, he gathered enough to build a 4-room school for the village that had saved him. They named it the Airman's Memorial School, a tribute not just to him, but to the shared sacrifice and courage that linked their lives. It stood as a bright, hopeful structure in a region where educational resources were desperately limited, and for the children of the village, it became a doorway to possibilities their parents had never imagined. But Hargesheimer's gratitude did not end with the school. Over time he raised funds for a clinic and a library, and he helped improve water access and community infrastructure. These were not symbolic gestures, they were meaningful contributions that shaped daily life in tangible ways. Eventually, he and his wife returned to live among the villagers for several years. He taught their children, learned their language, shared meals at their tables, and walked their footpaths not as a visitor, but as a member of the community. What began as an act of repayment grew into a lifelong bond, woven from courage, respect, and the enduring power of kindness across cultures. For decades after the war, Hargesheimer carried a quiet, persistent question that refused to fade. It returned in still moments, on long airplane flights, during nights when sleep was elusive, even when he stood in the school courtyard on New Britain watching children laugh and run. He would find himself transported back to the sky over the Pacific in 1943, remembering the moment he drifted beneath his parachute with nothing but a few cords and thin silk between himself and death. What haunted him was not the violence of being shot down, but the mercy that followed. Why had the Japanese pilot who struck his aircraft not circled back to finish the job, as so many pilots in that theater were trained, even expected to do? The Pacific War had been characterized by extraordinary brutality, and the logic of survival often left no room for hesitation. Yet someone had hesitated. Someone had chosen not to pull the trigger. That act of restraint, so small in the instant, had given Hargesheimer every remaining day of his life. The question mattered because it wasn't merely about tactics. It was about humanity. He had seen enough war to know how rare mercy could be. Allied survivors told countless stories of pilots who were strafed while parachuting, of lifeboats destroyed by enemy fire, of soldiers killed when they were no longer a threat. And yet Hargesheimer lived. It was almost as if a thin thread of compassion had reached across the battlefield and pulled him back from an abyss. The idea that one man's decision in the heat of combat could ripple forward for decades fascinated him. He believed deeply that understanding that moment might reveal something profound, not only about the pilot who spared him, but about the human capacity to choose compassion even in the harshest of circumstances. So he began searching. It was not easy, Wartime records were scattered, incomplete, or lost entirely. But with the help of amateur military historians, men and women who pored over unit rosters, flight logs, and surviving Japanese archives, he pieced together a trail that eventually led him to a name, Mitsugu Hayakutomi, a pilot from Yamaguchi Prefecture. This discovery alone felt monumental. It turned an anonymous silhouette in a cockpit into a real person with a home, a family, a story. In 1999, more than half a century after the dogfight that changed both their lives, Hargesheimer wrote a letter. He introduced himself gently, shared his memory of the encounter, and expressed gratitude rather than accusation. It was a gesture of humility, an invitation to connection rather than confrontation. By that time, Hayakutomi was elderly and living with Alzheimer's, unable to respond directly. Yet his wife replied with a grace that matched the moment. She explained that her husband had long told family members the same thing. He could not bring himself to shoot at a man drifting helplessly beneath a parachute. That simple truth, spoken softly through the voice of a loved one, carried immense weight. It affirmed what Hargesheimer had always hoped, that his life had been spared not by chance, but by a deliberate act of conscience. It was a reminder that even in a war filled with bitterness, fear, and dehumanization, individuals could still choose decency. For Hargesheimer, that knowledge brought peace. For the rest of us, it offers a powerful testament to the enduring impact of a single act of mercy. When Hargesheimer finally made his way to Japan to meet the family of the man who had changed the course of his life, he did so without cameras, parades, or reporters trailing behind. This was not a story crafted for the spotlight. It was an act of personal reconciliation rooted in humility. The world often celebrates grand gestures, the dramatic reunions splashed across headlines, but the reality of this meeting was far quieter and far more powerful. It took place in an ordinary home, the kind of space where everyday life unfolds, family photos on the walls, slippers by the door, the gentle hum of conversation. In that modest setting, two histories touched, one shaped by survival, the other shaped by a choice made in the split-second chaos of aerial combat. The absence of spectacle made the moment purer, as if the noise of the outside world had stepped aside to make room for something more honest. For Hargesheimer, this meeting was never about seeking closure through confrontation. He did not arrive with anger or demands, because the decades had taught him that surviving war leaves little room for bitterness when grace has played such a defining role. Instead, he carried with him curiosity, gratitude, and an earnest desire to understand the man whose restraint had allowed him to live. He knew that many veterans on both sides of the Pacific carried heavy memories, and he did not wish to add to anyone's burden. His questions were gentle. Who was Mitsugu Hayakutomi as a young man? What shaped his sense of honor? Did he ever speak of that day in 1943? These were not questions of accusation, but of shared humanity, offered in a spirit of respect. For Hayakutomi's family, the visit brought its own deep emotions. They had lived for years with the knowledge that their loved one had fought in a brutal conflict, one that took countless lives and left lasting scars on both nations. Yet here was an American airman, a man who could easily have been lost forever because of Hayakutomi's bullets, standing in their home, expressing gratitude rather than blame. They learned that their husband and father had shown mercy when the world around him was consumed by destruction. That mercy had not vanished into the fog of war. It had grown into schools, a clinic, a library, and opportunities for generations of children on a remote Pacific island. It is rare for any family to learn that a single act of restraint by their father had helped reshape an entire community half a world away. For them, it was a gift, a confirmation that even in war, goodness can survive. Their conversation, marked by pauses, smiles, and emotion that needed no translation, affirmed what Hargesheimer had long believed, that one moment of compassion can echo across time in ways no one could predict. He later reflected on the encounter with words that captured his profound gratitude. The Japanese pilot gave me the opportunity to get involved in something worthwhile. I'm ever grateful. Those words were not a simple expression of thanks. They were an acknowledgement of how interconnected human lives can become through choices made in the smallest slices of time. Hayakutomi spared a life, perhaps without understanding why, and that choice blossomed into decades of service and friendship that bridged cultures once divided by conflict. In the quiet of that meeting room, the distance between former enemies dissolved, revealing what remained two families connected by mercy, memory, and the enduring possibility of peace. By the time Fred Hargesheimer made his final return to New Britain in 2006, he was 90 years old, walking slowly, but with a heart full of memories that spanned decades and continents. The villagers who had once saved him from the perils of the jungle now carried him in a simple wooden chair, honoring both his survival and the extraordinary journey that had followed. They led him deep into the jungle to the crash site of his F-5, the Lockheed P-38 variant that had brought him so close to death all those years ago. The aircraft, long hidden by thick vines and moss, had been rediscovered only recently, a silent testament to the violence and fragility of wartime skies. As he looked upon the wreckage, Hargesheimer was surrounded not only by the green canopy of the jungle, but by thousands of villagers who had gathered to greet him. It was a ceremony devoid of pomp, yet heavy with meaning, an intimate acknowledgement of life, survival, and the bridges built across oceans by human courage. In that moment, Hargesheimer's place within the community was formalized in a way that transcended words. The WWII people named him Swaroru, or Chief Warrior, a title that carried the weight of both respect and affection. For a man who had spent his life as a quiet, humble veteran, it was a remarkable honor. It recognized not his wartime exploits alone, but the decades of dedication he had poured into the villagey schools, constructed with small donations, clinics built to tend to the sick, libraries stocked to educate curious minds. It was a recognition that true heroism is not measured in the fire of battle, but in the lives one touches, the hope one cultivates, and the love one extends across barriers of language, culture, and history. That title, spoken in the soft cadences of the WWII language, symbolized a full circle. From a terrified young pilot falling through the sky to a revered figure whose presence had shaped an entire community. Hargesheimer's legacy is remarkable, not because of medals or public accolades, but because of the tangible, enduring impact he left behind. When he passed away in 2010, he left far more than stories of survival. He left institutions that continued to nurture, heal, and educate. The Airman's Memorial School still stands, a place where generations of children discover not only reading and arithmetic, but also the story of compassion that brought it into being. The clinic continues to provide care to villagers who might otherwise have gone without. And beyond these bricks and mortar, he left something more intangible but infinitely more powerful, a model of gratitude in action. His life demonstrates that when gratitude moves from a private feeling to public service, it can ripple outward, transforming communities and altering destinies. Fred Hargesheimer's journey, from a young American pilot plummeting toward death, to a survivor hidden by strangers, to a man who returned decades later to repay his debt with love and service, stands as a profound example of the human capacity to turn trauma into purpose. It reminds us that even in the darkest chapters of history, acts of courage, restraint, and kindness endure. In every school built, every life touched, and every story shared across oceans, his presence remains, a quiet yet powerful testament to the truth that one individual's gratitude can echo across generations. In this way, Hargesheimer's life was more than survival. It was a mission of humanity, leaving behind a legacy that will continue to inspire long after the man himself has gone. This story matters because it reminds us that mercy can exist even in the most brutal circumstances. During the chaos of the Pacific War, Mitsugu Hayakutomi made a choice that went against the rules and expectations of combat. He refused to fire on an enemy pilot descending helplessly by parachute. In a conflict defined by destruction, discipline, and duty, that single decision carried no material cost to him, no strategic disadvantage, no risk of retribution. But it spoke volumes about moral courage. It reminds us that even in situations where violence seems inevitable, human beings retain the capacity for restraint, compassion, and conscience. That moment of mercy created a ripple effect that extended far beyond the battlefield, changing the life of a young pilot, influencing entire communities, and demonstrating that ethical choices can be more powerful than acts of destruction. The story also illustrates the transformative power of survival and gratitude. Fred Hargesheimer did not simply escape death and return home. He transformed his experience into a life of profound service. After being rescued and recovering from the trauma of the jungle, he could have retreated into private life, satisfied simply with having survived. Instead, he turned the debt he felt toward the villagers, who saved him, into decades of tangible contributions. From the Airman's Memorial School to a clinic, a library, and infrastructure improvements, Hargesheimer devoted himself to improving the lives of those who had once protected him. His survival became a mission, a vehicle for creating opportunity, hope, and stability in a remote corner of the world. In doing so, he demonstrated that near-death experiences, instead of leaving only scars, can become catalysts for empathy, purpose, and meaningful action. Equally important is the story of reconciliation, which unfolds not with grand gestures or public spectacle, but with quiet human connection. When Hargesheimer eventually reached out to Hargesheimer and his family decades later, the meeting was intimate, personal, and deeply human. There were no ceremonies, no cameras, no headlines, just acknowledgement, understanding, and shared history. In this encounter, we see that reconciliation does not always require dramatic displays or formal apologies. Sometimes it simply requires honesty, humility, and the courage to reach across the divides that war has created. The meeting affirmed the enduring human capacity for forgiveness, gratitude, and understanding, showing that emotional restoration can be achieved even after decades of separation and trauma. Finally, Hargesheimer's story reminds us that the legacy of war need not be only destruction. While conflicts often leave ruins, burned villages, lost lives, shattered landscapes, this story demonstrates that even the harshest circumstances can yield something lasting and constructive. Through schools, clinics, libraries, and community development, war inadvertently gave rise to a network of human kindness, cross-cultural understanding, and education that continues to affect generations. The impact of one person's gratitude, nurtured and multiplied over decades, is a powerful counterpoint to the narrative of destruction that usually dominates war stories. In the end, this story is a testament to the choices we make in the face of violence, the resilience of the human spirit, and the extraordinary outcomes that can emerge when courage, mercy, and compassion guide our actions. So I invite you to pause for a moment and reflect. What if more of us carried even a fraction of the gratitude that defined Fred Hargesheimer's life? Imagine the world if, instead of allowing anger, resentment, or bitterness to take root, we chose to act with generosity and purpose. Hargesheimer's gratitude was not passive, it became action. He repaid a life saved by building schools, clinics, and libraries, by teaching children, by investing decades of effort into a community halfway around the world. His life challenges us to consider how we might respond when kindness is shown to us, and how far-reaching the consequences of our gratitude could be. Even small gestures, repeated consistently over time, can transform lives, communities, and the world itself. This story is not simply about the unlikely mercy of a Japanese pilot or the survival of an American airman. It is about the extraordinary power of human compassion and moral courage, carried across oceans, decades, and generations. Hargesheimer's choice in a split second, a refusal to fire on a helpless enemy, created a ripple effect that reached far beyond the battlefield. It shaped not only Hargesheimer's life, but the lives of countless villagers in New Britain, and through their children, the future of a community. In a world that often measures heroism by strength or victory, this story reminds us that true courage can be quiet and invisible, expressed in mercy, in ethical restraint, and in acts of kindness that leave no immediate trace yet echo for decades. We are also reminded that reconciliation does not need to be grandiose or performative. When Hargesheimer met Hargesheimer's family, more than 50 years later, there was no spectacle, no public fanfare, only connection, acknowledgement, and understanding. Their quiet meeting shows us that healing can be simple, deeply human, and profoundly meaningful. It is a lesson for our lives. Bridges can be built with honesty, respect, and empathy, even across the deepest divides. Every small effort to understand, to forgive, or to connect with someone we may once have considered an opponent, carries the potential to reshape relationships and histories alike. Finally, this story calls us to carry forward the spirit of service and compassion into our own lives. Hargesheimer turned near death into decades of meaningful action, demonstrating that we are capable of extraordinary contributions when we let gratitude guide us. Each act of giving, whether large or small, whether personal or public, can ripple outward in ways we cannot predict. His life reminds us that even amid the hardships, the tragedies, and the conflicts of the world, there is room for courage, empathy, and generosity. If we carry that spirit forward, we honor not only the lives of those who came before us, but the better possibilities within ourselves. Thank you.